In the winter of 1471, the city council of Nördlingen received a report from the very brothel they licensed and taxed. A woman named Els von Eistedt was forced into prostitution, became pregnant, and was then forced to drink a homemade abortifacient until she miscarried at 20 weeks. Els survived. The brothel owner was branded with hot iron on the forehead and banished from the city. But the terrifying part is that after the trial concluded, the brothel continued operating as normal. Els became one of the very few medieval prostitutes whose name was recorded by history, only because her story was severe enough to become a court file. Meanwhile, thousands of other women vanished entirely from history before the age of 30. No names, no graves, no one recording how they died. And when historians pieced together court records, excavated skeletons, and medical documents of the era, they discovered that what killed these women wasn't just disease. It was an entire system built to erode them slowly. Number 1. Medieval cities ran their own brothels. When thinking of medieval sex workers, what comes to mind? Figures shivering in muddy alleys, or fates hidden away in the shadows of cathedrals? The truth shatters that stereotype. For about 2 centuries, in many bustling European metropolises, brothels were not something that sprouted up in secret. They existed out in the open, and the people collecting fines, issuing business licenses, were the city authorities themselves. Let's reopen an archive in Venice in 1358. Inside a solemn chamber, the Great Council sealed an administrative document with wax. In it, they referred to prostitution as something absolutely necessary for the world. By 1403, Venice had opened a public brothel right in the Rialto district, the busiest market, swarming with foot traffic. Everything was laid bare under the sunlight. In Dijon, France, a 1349 record describes the Chateau Gaillard brothel as a complex. 20 private rooms, roaring fireplaces, a noisy dining area, and covered walkways. Ironically, the manager of that establishment was called an abbess, a title inherently reserved for the superior of a convent of nuns. Why did city halls get their hands dirty directly? Look at the city maps of the era. Public brothels were often situated right next to docks reeking of salt, beside barracks clattering with swords and spears, or nestled among markets smelling heavily of ale. Wherever there were single men, mercenaries, there was a brothel. Authorities zoned them exactly the same way they built a toll house or a guard tower. They collected licensing fees. They taxed every single customer. They ran a money-printing machine. Theologian Thomas Aquinas once made a chilling analogy. Prostitution in the towns is like the cesspool in the palace. Take away the cesspool, and the palace will become an unclean and stinking place. That is why this machine was tolerated. The church could stand at the pulpit and condemn the sin. But down on the ground, a portion of the tax money generated from women's bodies silently flowed into local treasuries. This entire system was never built to protect the women inside it. It was built as a pressure release valve for men, to keep the night streets free of violence. Those women were not considered citizens. They were fuel, the expendable parts of a massive machine. And the machine doesn't care how its gears are being worn down. Managers could be transferred, contracts could be renewed. But for the girls inside, the brothel doors usually only opened one way. There was no going back. In Bolzano, Italy, the law forbade them from wearing jewelry when stepping out onto the street. The purpose wasn't protection. The purpose was so the crowd could easily point at, identify, and isolate them from normal women. That system didn't just imprison bodies, it suffocated dignity. But the most terrifying part didn't lie in these laws. It lay in the age of the bodies thrown into that machine. Number 2. Most began when they were far too young. No child is born dreaming of growing up to walk through the doors of a city brothel. But in 13th to 15th century Europe, there were brutal, trodden paths that pushed them straight inside. Look at what they faced before selling their bodies. Medieval Europe had no free meals, no cozy orphanages. How long could a girl who lost her family, possessing no dowry, shivering in the freezing winter, hold out? Becoming a servant required a guarantor. Weaving clothes for hire paid pennies that weren't even enough for black bread. The gnawing hunger in the stomach always made decisions faster than reason. And sometimes, hunger wasn't as terrifying as the tongues of society. Court records in Lyon or Toulouse document a bitter reality. Many victims of sexual assault became outcasts. A whisper passed around the market. A look of disdain. Girl deemed sullied, lost almost all chance of a respectable marriage or honest work. The doors of the community slammed shut in her face. The only path left open, ironically, was the one leading to the brothel. Many archives note that their starting age ranged from 13 to 16 years old. Imagine that image. Bodies that hadn't even fully blossomed. Archaeological studies on the skeletal remains of the medieval poor reveal rampant signs of rickets, malnutrition, and fragile bone density caused by prolonged starvation. The vast majority of these girls did not enter the brothel with a healthy physique. They entered with a body already worn out and depleted. And once inside, how could they escape? Sometimes, iron locks and chains were unnecessary. They used numbers, a yellowing leather ledger filled with scribbled debts. Rent for the bed, money for dresses, bread, medicine. Everything was tallied up and deducted directly from their cheap-wage wages. That debt stretched out like a life sentence, with no judgment day. Along with the debts, the label of prostitute stuck to them permanently. Out in society, no one would hire them. Families turned their backs. Returning was impossible. If you flip through the administrative books of the era, you will see the names of the tax collectors and the brothel keepers written clearly. But the girls who vanished from those dark rooms due to disease, collapse, or death left almost not a single drop of ink behind. They bled their youth dry for the stability of the city, only to evaporate from history without a sound. That silence is the coldest sound of all. Number 3. The erosion machine. From moldy rooms to decaying bodies, forget the romanticized images in movies. If you could push open the door of a 14th century brothel, you wouldn't find red velvet curtains, flickering candlelight, or rooms carrying the faint scent of perfume. The enemy here is invisible. It doesn't tear with bloody slashes, it gnaws. That destruction process began with the living space itself. Archaeological records show the majority of the girls had to live in low, suffocating stone rooms. In winter, the stone walls sucked away all warmth. In summer, they trapped the stifling heat and oppressive body odor. Windows, if any, were only the size of a hand. Floors were usually packed dirt or rotting wooden planks. Amidst that cramped space, the only thing called a bed was often just a straw-stuffed mattress. And that mattress was almost never dry. Dozens of clients passing through every day left behind sweat, breath, saliva, and excretions. After just a few weeks, the straw decomposed, emitting a pungent stench of mold. Medieval people didn't know how mold destroyed the pleura. They only knew they had to breathe that thick air every night. They didn't lie alone either. Lice hid in their hair. Fleas waited beneath the damp straw, biting their thighs and ankles to shreds. Transient clients continuously brought new pathogens, turning the room into a parasite transit station. Living in such an environment, what did their bodies have to defend themselves with? Don't think of banquets laden with meat. The daily meal for these fates was just rock-hard black bread, watery barley gruel, and a few bland boiled vegetables. Severe protein deficiency didn't kill them immediately. It forced their bodies to cannibalize themselves. Muscle mass thinned. Bones became brittle. Simultaneously, micro-traumas in the pelvic region caused by the overload of clients had no time to heal. They accumulated, overlapping into chronic inflammatory pockets. To numb that pain, they poured cheap liquid into their stomachs. Ale. Pouring alcohol into a starving body is no different than throwing acid on a thin sheet of paper. Livers degenerated rapidly. The whites of their eyes gradually turned a sickly, cloudy yellow. But the cruelest tragedy of this system was they had almost no right to be sick. If a blacksmith was exhausted, he could drop his hammer and rest. But here, the manager's ledger knew no mercy. Every day without a client was a day rent, bread, and medicine accumulated interest. Therefore, even with a forehead burning with fever, even coughing up thick phlegm, they still had to plaster powder on their hollow cheeks stand up, and pull down their dresses. Their bodies had to brace against infection while continuing to open their doors to mechanical erosion. That is why a 20-year-old girl here carried the broken-down organs of a 50-year-old woman. Do you know what haunts researchers the most when looking into these rooms? In 1998, in Aalst, Belgium, archaeologists excavated the dirt floor of a 14th-century brothel. Deep beneath the rotting wooden planks, they found a skeleton. It was not a client or a sex worker. It was the skeleton of an infant, about 3 months old. Forensic analysis showed the baby had been breastfed. A mother had tried to raise it in the darkness of that suffocating room. But when the baby died, it was hastily buried right under the floorboards, where the mother had to continue living, continue draining her strength to receive clients every night, right on top of her child's grave. No headstone. Not a single line of obituary in the city records mentioning the existence of those two human beings. And those were just the normal days, the days before violent beatings or pandemics. Because for this system, something far more brutal was always lying in wait. Number 4. Then syphilis arrived, the nightmare from within August 1494. King Charles V of France led an army of 50,000 into Italy. Following the gleaming rows of spears was a vibrant ecosystem. Blacksmiths, merchants, and of course, flocks of prostitutes trailing the barracks. That winter, in Naples, an unnamed epidemic began to erupt. Bizarre, non-scabbing ulcers appeared. Pustules covered the skin. Bone-deep agony made patients scream through the night. Flesh ulcerated and fell off in chunks, a sight contemporaries horrifyingly described as being eaten from the inside. The French soldiers called it the Neapolitan disease. The Neapolitans threw the name right back, the French disease. When the campaign ended, the remnants of the army scattered, carrying pathogens that cast a dark shadow over all of Europe in just a few short years. Syphilis didn't just strike healthy bodies. It struck the prostitutes around the docks and barracks head-on. Bodies already depleted from starvation, and chronic infections now bore the most horrific devastation. Medicine of that era was completely blind. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria. The only solution they threw at these rotting bodies was mercury. They smeared the toxic metal onto open wounds, locked patients in sealed chambers, fumigating them with toxic gas until they sweated buckets, believing the pathogen would escape with it. But what was expelled in reality was life itself. Teeth fell out in droves, gums necrotized, leaking black blood. Entire bodies shook in frantic convulsions. Countless girls didn't even have time to die from syphilis before this very cure finished them off in ultimate agony. The scene was as haunting as a medical slaughterhouse. And when the ulcer-ridden girls collapsed, how did the authorities react? They did not provide treatment. In many places, they threw anyone showing signs of the disease out onto the street, losing their jobs and shelter right at the peak of their agony. Meanwhile, the clinking of tax coins from the brothels continued to drop steadily into the treasury. The machine kept running, only the gears inside were shattering. Number 5. When they no longer make money. The invisible disappearance. An unwritten law existing in every medieval brothel was, your value lies in your ability to generate revenue. Aging in this environment occurred at the speed of light. Hacking coughs, aching joints, and chronic inflamed areas ravaged their looks. A 25-year-old girl in a brothel carried the decaying body of a 50-year-old. And when the sound of clients' footsteps dwindled outside her door, the system automatically purged her. No termination papers needed, no severance packages. The manager only needed to tighten the debt. Room rent, bread, and medicine costs rose daily while revenue hit zero. The debt trap that had imprisoned their youth now turned into the broom that swept them out the door. Pushed onto the street at 25, with a diseased body and the label of prostitute pinned to their names, where did they go? Some drifted to dark street corners, operating independently under lurking dangers, stripped of all protection. Some sought out church almshouses, but those places were always overcrowded and had no cure for tuberculosis or late-stage syphilis. Many were reduced to begging, collapsing by freezing roadsides. And the vast majority simply disappeared. No death certificates, no one looking for them. Archaeology and administrative records have revealed a chilling reality. Their deaths were rarely recorded. Historian Jacques Rousseau, while searching through 14th century court files in Dijon, discovered that violence in brothels happened so frequently it was considered normal. One rare case was actually recorded. A pregnant woman was dragged outside by the managers and thrown into the freezing snow. The incident was logged not because the woman's life was valued. It was recorded simply because her death created a minor legal property complication for the brothel owner. As for those who died silently, causing no trouble, history just closed its eyes. When a girl disappeared, the machine didn't skip a beat. A younger, hungrier girl would step in to fill the void. The fireplace kept burning, taxes kept pouring in, and the brothel kept its lights on. The greatest cruelty of this system didn't lie in the beatings or the ulcerating diseases. It lay in the indifference, in the way an entire society, from authorities to clients, unanimously viewed these human beings as a resource to be squeezed dry, thrown away, and replaced without the slightest bit of concern. Number 6. The most terrifying thing wasn't the disease. In the early 16th century, Europe was changing in multiple directions simultaneously. Syphilis raged across the continent. Cities grappled with a disease they couldn't understand and had virtually no real way to cure. The merchant class grew stronger, dragging a shift in urban power structures along with it. And in Wittenberg, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther was preparing to do something that would split the Western Church in half. In 1517, Luther published his 95 Theses. The Protestant Reformation began, and on the list of things deemed symbols of moral decay that needed to be eradicated were the city brothels. Augsburg closed its brothel in 1532. Basel followed in 1534. Frankfurt in 1560. Many other cities in southern Germany and Switzerland did the same during this period. Spain and Catholic regions moved slower, but the general trend remained. Establishments once licensed and taxed were now criminalized. What is noteworthy isn't the closure decision itself. It is the people who signed it. In many cases, it was the exact same families who had sat on the city council for generations. The sons or grandsons of the men who had signed the brothel licensing contracts were now signing the orders to shut them down under the guise of moral reform. The system didn't change its operators. It only changed the vocabulary used to describe itself. And there is a detail glaringly obvious when reading the surviving closure decrees. Almost no document spoke about what would happen to the women inside after the facilities were abolished. No transition plans, no financial support, no debt resolution, no alternative vocational training. The text focused purely on morality, social order, and enforcing the new rules. Women within the system barely appeared as specific human beings requiring consequence management. They simply vanished from the texts along with the very establishments they had lived in. But demand does not disappear just because a building is closed. And this is what cities quickly realized. Prostitution didn't vanish, it just became more invisible. Within the licensed brothel system, despite the exploitation and violence, there was at least a minimal layer of management. The authorities knew the location. Brothel owners could be called in for questioning if a major incident occurred. Certain regulations, no matter how loosely enforced, still existed on paper. When the entire operation was pushed underground, even that fragile layer of control evaporated. Everything moved into inns, back alleys, basements, and unofficial residential areas. No clear addresses, no records, no one to complain to. And once the activity was criminalized, the woman herself became the one at risk of arrest if she sought out the authorities. The old system exploited them publicly. The new system rendered them completely invisible. This happened precisely during the period when syphilis was still ravaging Europe. The women who had just been shoved out of the legal system now continued to live in an even more dangerous environment, while no effective treatment existed. Penicillin was nearly 4 centuries away. Mercury, the most common treatment, often caused more damage without curing the disease. Closing brothels did not make syphilis disappear. It only severed the last remaining connection points between the highest risk group and whatever medical or legal structures still existed. And that is when the true answer to the title of this entire story is revealed. These women rarely lived past 30, not just because of syphilis, not just because of violence, not because of a depraved lifestyle, as many moral texts of the era desperately tried to portray. The answer lies in the accumulation. A body already malnourished from childhood, entering the system far too early, then being continuously eroded by labor, sleep deprivation, disease, a toxic living environment, and unending pressure. When syphilis struck, that body no longer had the resources to fight back, and when they no longer generated profit, the system discarded them without leaving any significant trace. No single blow killed them. It was multiple layers of consecutive erosion, dragging on for years, upon a body that never had enough time to recover. And the most terrifying part of this entire story is not the disease, but the system that knew all of this was happening, yet continued to operate normally for hundreds of years. City councils knew women in brothels were treated poorly. Otherwise, regulations banning beatings wouldn't have existed on paper. They knew the life expectancy in that environment was low. Otherwise, they wouldn't have needed to constantly recruit new girls. They knew syphilis was destroying these people first, because their own city doctors reported it. But taxes were still collected. Contracts were still signed. And come Sunday, the men who signed those documents still walked into church as respectable citizens. When the Protestant Reformation provided the political opportunity to close the brothels, they changed their tune very quickly. The people who once profited from the system now stood up to speak about morality and the purity of the city, then wrote their own names into history as reformers. History often loves to tell the story of the Renaissance through paintings, cathedrals, and artistic geniuses. It loves to tell of the Italian wars, Martin Luther, and the shifting religious map of Europe. But no one talks about the thousands of women who were trapped beneath that entire machine. Els von Eistedt is remembered because her incident became a court case. Someone was forced to write it down. But in Aalst, Belgium, beneath the floor of a 14th-century brothel room, archaeologists found the skeleton of an infant buried right under the floorboards. Bone analysis showed the baby had been breastfed before dying. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't thrown away like trash. Someone held onto it and buried it with their own hands beneath the very room they lived in. We don't know that mother's name. We don't know how much longer she lived. We don't know how she left that place. We only know that in a system that left almost no trace of the existence of people like her, she still tried to leave a mark for her child. And perhaps that is the most human part remaining amidst this entire machine.